Picture the scene for a second before we dive into any of the specific details here, because I genuinely think the human context matters more than the individual headlines that have been circulating. A wounded veteran, someone who lost a limb, their sight, or their hearing in active service to their own country, signs up to compete in the Invictus Games specifically because one man told them, personally and repeatedly across many years, that this particular cause was his own life's work, that it genuinely meant more to him than almost anything else he had ever publicly committed himself to. And then, in the run-up to the 1 year to go milestone for Birmingham 2027, that same veteran spends 2 straight weeks watching headline after headline about security reports, motorcades, and whether Meghan is coming to the UK, and starts to wonder whether the man who made that promise is still the same man who made it.
Prince Harry has just lost the plot. I know a lot of you will think that happened a long time ago, but this is the height of insanity.
That is the actual emotional core sitting underneath everything that has been circulating this month, underneath all the specific claims and counterclaims and dueling interpretations that tend to dominate the headlines. And I think it deserves to be named clearly and honestly before we work carefully through the actual details one by one. In order, let's start with the document that kicked most of this off, because the specifics matter considerably more than the headline version most people absorbed.
Prince William has stepped over Prince Harry, over the royal rota, and he's doing it as he wants to. He's doing media on his terms.
Last month, according to multiple reports, a confidential security assessment document was delivered to RAVEC, the UK government committee specifically responsible for evaluating and making decisions about protection requests of exactly this kind for figures who no longer automatically qualify for state-funded security. The document, said to run around 40 pages, was reportedly prepared by a private security firm based in Los Angeles. Here is where the critical detail sits, the one that a lot of the initial coverage did not make sufficiently clear. This report was reportedly commissioned and paid for by Harry himself. He hired a private security company, at what was reportedly significant cost, to produce an assessment of the risks he personally faces. According to reports, the document described several alleged threats in considerable detail, including claims of specific plots reportedly originating within Britain itself, references to an actual Al-Qaeda document that had apparently surfaced somewhere within the broader intelligence landscape, and hundreds of separate potential stalking concerns that had reportedly been compiled from various sources over an extended period of time, painting a picture of persistent and wide-ranging risk.
It behoves William and Catherine to make sure that he feels, they can bring him along slowly. And involved in the armed forces is a perfect way to do that.
ITV News was the outlet that first broke coverage of the report specifically, and from there, multiple other major outlets picked up and repeated its central findings across their own coverage. But critics have argued that a lot of that coverage focused heavily on the reported threats without always making equally clear that the assessment came from a privately commissioned document rather than an independent government investigation. The way a lot of people absorbed the coverage was simple. This is real, this is serious, this is why he needs protection. What critics say did not receive nearly the same level of attention in most of the initial coverage is a fairly basic and honestly quite obvious principle once you actually think about it. When a private security firm is directly paid by the very subject of its own assessment to go and evaluate that same subject's personal risk level, its resulting conclusions should probably be weighed carefully alongside other genuinely independent evaluations, rather than being treated uncritically as the final and definitive word on the actual threat level. According to the account being presented by critics, the government's actual response was notably limited. RAVEC reportedly did not hold a new reassessment meeting in response to the report. There was no public debate, no formal review process triggered at that stage, just according to this account, quiet continuation of the existing arrangement.
He will not receive enhanced security for his upcoming trip to the UK next month, raising fresh questions about whether Meghan Markle, Archie and Lily will ultimately accompany him. The Royal and VIP Executive Committee, RAVEC, has declined requests for additional protection just days before Harry is scheduled to return to Britain for a series of engagements.
Then came the letter. And this is genuinely the detail that a lot of people say actually reframed the entire conversation once it became more widely known. After the report, after the headlines, after everything that had been building, the response was reportedly much simpler than expected. Harry was given the contact information for a liaison officer rather than being offered automatic police protection, a motorcade, or any elevated official status. For critics, that specific detail, a phone number rather than an actual protective operation, says a genuinely significant amount about how officials must have actually assessed the underlying situation internally, away from public statements. Their argument is that if the government had genuinely concluded there was an elevated risk level requiring additional measures, established procedure would likely have produced a different response. Others may read that decision differently, but the critical reading is that the liaison officer response reflected the government's own independent assessment rather than the conclusions of the privately commissioned report. Here is the question that a lot of ordinary commenters raised on social media in the aftermath of all this, and I think it is genuinely worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes the whole debate in a way that most professional commentary somehow missed.
As we've seen, nothing about them is unique. Nothing about them is inherently interesting, with the exception of his family.
If someone truly believed there were multiple active threats against their family, genuinely feared an assassination attempt, and thought their own children faced serious risk in a specific country, would they choose to bring those children there anyway? A lot of critics argue the honest answer is no, that most parents who sincerely believe the danger was at that level would avoid exposing their children to it entirely, regardless of what protective measures were or were not in place. But that is exactly what Harry publicly indicated he planned to do. The visit was announced ahead of time, with reports discussing possible dates, locations, the Invictus Games themselves, and even the possibility of visiting family or Diana's grave. Critics argue that if the actual level of danger matched the most serious version of the public claims, publicly sharing detailed travel plans involving his own family would be difficult to reconcile with that level of concern. Stay with me, because there is another explanation that a lot of critics believe fits the publicly available facts considerably better than a pure safety narrative. What if the central issue was never really about personal safety and isolation at all, at any point in this entire multi-year dispute? What if the security debate has always been, at least partly, connected to a much broader and considerably more unresolved disagreement over official status, recognition, and what someone is entitled to after formally leaving an institution?
We have members of the royal family, quite clearly. She was just recently outside of the royal box at Wimbledon, going to other places as well, which we may discuss later. Point is, other members of the royal family are willing to take more risks with their lives. They are outside of the royal family. We have this excuse that they can't come to the UK because of the security threat.
Here is what a lot of people specifically point to as evidence for this alternative reading of the whole situation. Harry has personally traveled in recent years to Ukraine during active conflict, to Colombia, and to Nigeria, countries that all carry genuinely documented and well-established security challenges, in some cases considerably more acute and more immediate than anything currently facing London on any given day. Meghan reportedly accompanied him on at least some of these particular trips, and reports consistently indicate that this family travel occurred without anything even remotely close to the same level of sustained public security debate, media scrutiny, or dispute that has specifically surrounded their UK visits over the past several years. Critics argue that this particular contrast is genuinely difficult to fully reconcile if the underlying and stated concern is purely and exclusively about physical personal safety.
Madman, and I really do mean that, has leaked his own security report, which he had previously submitted to the government to try and get you, to try and get me, British taxpayers, to spend millions and millions of pounds a year to ensure that he has armed guards wherever he goes.
Though others note fairly and reasonably that every single destination involves a genuinely different and highly specific risk assessment process, and that directly comparing security needs across such wildly different countries and contexts may not actually be an entirely fair or useful exercise in the first place. If this breakdown is giving you more than the surface version everyone else is running, the like button helps this channel keep doing exactly that. Hit it and stay with me, because the specific detail about the courtroom photograph is where this story took its strangest turn. Critics say the first genuinely major credibility questions about the report emerged specifically when people, largely on social media rather than in professional coverage, started looking considerably more closely at its detailed contents rather than simply accepting the headline summary. One section reportedly referred to a woman who had allegedly gained access to a London courtroom on 2 separate occasions. At first glance, a lot of readers understandably interpreted that as a genuinely serious security concern, assuming it pointed towards someone dangerous. Then online discussion identified the woman in question as someone widely known and described as a devoted, entirely public Sussex supporter. the kind of enthusiastic fan who shows up to court hearings because she is a genuine admirer, not someone with any documented connection to threats or violence of any kind.
All the drip feeding coming out, going to see the grave of Diana, going to Invictus. Meghan might make some public appearances, but probably won't with the children. Where they're going to stay. And then you get the story, well, now they may not come because he's not happy with the security arrangement.
Critics argued this specific and quite embarrassing detail fundamentally changed how they read the entirety of the rest of the document from that point forward. If a well-known, entirely benign supporter had been included as part of the overall threat picture, it raised a reasonable question about what else in the 40 pages might deserve the same closer scrutiny. Critics also separately point to what they see as a directly related inconsistency involving Wimbledon, which surfaced around roughly the same period. Images from the tournament showed Catherine, the Princess of Wales and future queen, sitting among the crowd with people visible close by, without obvious barriers or heavily visible security measures, even accounting for the fact that protective arrangements are often deliberately designed to stay out of public view rather than being absent entirely.
If there is a specific threat, like a terror threat, security will immediately be provided. Because Harry's team keep on trying to say this line, Rafe, and it's not true. This is the problem. They just lie through their teeth. It makes me sick that journalists just swallow it. They keep saying, oh, Taylor Swift gets security when she comes to the UK. No.
One widely shared comment put it simply, you would have a hard job spotting any security around Catherine at times. Critics point specifically to that image and that moment, alongside her broader pattern of continued public appearances following her own cancer treatment, as evidence that the general public risk environment across the UK generally may not match the picture painted in the specific privately commissioned report that Harry's team produced. Others push back that security decisions are based on individual, specific threat assessments rather than any general national risk level, and that visible security is never the full picture regardless of who is being protected. There is another entire thread running through a lot of this public discussion right now, and I think it is worth pulling out separately because it centers less on Harry as the primary decision-maker and more specifically on who else might genuinely be shaping his decisions from behind the scenes. Some panel discussions and commentary pieces have turned specifically and directly to Meghan on this particular question, with various commentators offering a genuinely wide and often contradictory range of theories about why she has spent such comparatively limited time in the UK relative to how frequently Harry himself has traveled there. One royal analyst put forward a theory that circulated widely, that she does not actually want to come, that she is genuinely afraid of a poor public reception, and that she has allowed Harry to believe the security situation is more dangerous than it is specifically so that his request for protection fails, giving them both a ready-made excuse not to travel. I want to be clear that this is an opinion, not an established fact, and plenty of people disagree with it entirely, but it is the kind of theory that keeps surfacing precisely because critics believe they can see a pattern. When restraint would serve the moment, the public response tends toward confrontation instead, and when the couple is expected to simply move forward quietly, something new tends to surface that reopens the entire dispute. Critics have also pointed separately to a genuine wave of staff departures from Archewell over recent years, noting that several former employees offered some close version of the exact same explanation on their way out the door, that they had, in their own words, accomplished what they originally came to do, a phrase that sounds neutral on its surface but has generated considerable speculation underneath it. That phrase has been interpreted in a lot of different ways by different observers, and no single explanation for the pattern has ever been formally confirmed by anyone involved. Separately from the staff departures, there have also been media reports referencing specific comments from some Montecito residents themselves, describing Harry and Meghan as somewhat distant or noticeably selective in how they approach relationships within their own local community, despite living there for several years now. One widely circulated account from a former insider claimed that Meghan would look over your shoulder while speaking with you, apparently scanning the room for a more valuable connection even mid-conversation. That is one specific person's individual account, not any kind of verified or established broader pattern, but critics have nonetheless referenced it repeatedly and consistently over time when discussing broader public perceptions of how she personally approaches networking and building relationships in social settings. Some commentators have gone further, arguing that Harry has gradually adopted a similar public style himself, though that remains firmly in the territory of opinion rather than anything close to established fact. Then, about 2 weeks ago, something happened in an entirely different context that a lot of people immediately read as a direct and quite pointed contrast to everything we have just discussed. William appeared on the Kelsey Brothers podcast without the kind of intense advance buildup a royal media appearance typically generates. He simply sat down, answered questions, and had what came across as a genuinely relaxed conversation. Supporters watching the episode saw it as authentic and genuinely easy to connect with, the kind of natural charisma that cannot really be manufactured or rehearsed in advance. Critics of Harry argued the appearance highlighted a fairly stark contrast with years of Harry's own public efforts to build that exact same kind of broad, seemingly effortless connection with a wide and diverse audience. Efforts that have, in this critical reading, often felt considerably more calculated, considerably more deliberately staged, and considerably less genuinely relaxed by direct comparison. Travis Kelce's introduction of William at the start of that episode was notably warm and detailed, going well beyond the standard professional courtesy you would expect from a podcast host, and a lot of viewers specifically commented afterward on that warmth as a genuine and unscripted sign of regard rather than anything performed for the cameras. Around roughly the same general period, actor Eugene Levy was separately asked, in an entirely different interview context, whether he had discussed Harry and Meghan at all during his own personal conversation with William. His answer was simple: "I didn't ask about it, it wasn't of interest. I had better things to talk to him about." Supporters of William pointed to that specific and fairly dismissive response as strong evidence that conversations happening around him in his actual day-to-day professional life genuinely tend to focus on his substantive work rather than gravitating automatically toward royal family drama the way so much media coverage does. Critics of Harry drew the comparison directly. While Harry has spent years publicly discussing his grievances across interviews, documentaries, and a memoir, William has spent that same period building long-term initiatives and showing up consistently for the institutional work itself. Catherine completed the Three Peaks Challenge roughly 18 months after finishing her own cancer treatment, raising money specifically for the hospital that had provided her care throughout that difficult period, and did the entire thing with relatively little advance fanfare or media buildup, deliberately keeping public attention focused on the underlying cause and the fundraising itself rather than on her own personal achievement in completing something physically demanding. William has taken part in a range of radio interviews, podcast appearances, and public conversations across recent months, which supporters see as genuine trust-building rather than a calculated media strategy. Meanwhile, critics argue Harry has remained largely fixed on the long-running security and status dispute, unable or unwilling to move past it in his own public presence. Supporters of William's approach argue he deliberately chose a different path after witnessing what sustained intense media attention did to his own mother, choosing instead to emphasize consistency and long-term public service over personal narrative. Critics of Harry, by direct contrast, argue that he has too often and too directly connected his mother's memory specifically to his own present-day grievances, disputes, and public arguments, effectively using her story and her legacy to reinforce and legitimize his own ongoing position, rather than allowing her memory and her actual legacy to stand independently and separately from his current disputes with the institution. Here is what a lot of people say gets lost entirely when the surrounding coverage stays fixed purely on the emotional drama of this ongoing story rather than on the underlying pattern. Multiple genuinely separate institutions have reportedly reached broadly similar conclusions about this exact situation, apparently independently of each other, and without any obvious coordination behind the scenes. Critics point not just to the UK government's own specific and formal decision on this matter, but also to the palace's separate public position, to the relevant oversight committee's notable lack of any formal escalation process being triggered, and to the genuinely conspicuous absence of any visible or public support from senior working royals throughout this entire extended dispute. The palace has publicly stated that security decisions are a matter for the Home Office specifically, reinforcing that the royal family itself is not the body making these determinations. William and Catherine have not made any public statements on this specific dispute either way, choosing instead to remain entirely silent on the matter throughout its various developments. Some observers read Charles's own continued silence on this issue as evidence that he could have chosen to intervene supportively at some point and simply chose not to. Others point out, fairly and reasonably, that government security decisions of this kind formally operate independently of the reigning monarch's personal wishes or preferences, entirely regardless of his own personal relationship with any individual family member involved in the dispute. when multiple genuinely separate institutions, each operating independently and without any obvious coordination between them, arrive at broadly similar conclusions about the same underlying question. Critics argue that specific pattern deserves genuine and sustained attention rather than simply being dismissed as coincidence or bad luck. In their reading, it reflects how the available evidence was actually assessed by people with no particular incentive to align with each other, rather than evidence of any kind of coordinated conspiracy against Harry specifically. Critics also argue, taking a considerably broader view of this entire situation than any single incident allows for, that the security dispute was never really only about security in the narrow literal sense of the word. They believe it came to represent a much larger and more fundamental question about status, recognition, and what continued privileges someone can reasonably expect after formally stepping back from an institution. In this particular reading of the situation, leaving the royal family formally and publicly meant leaving behind not just the titles themselves, but the entire underlying structure of official state-backed support that came directly attached to those titles in the first place. And the ongoing request for a security level typically reserved for working royals became, in this view, part of a broader and still unresolved disagreement about identity and continued institutional responsibility. Others disagree entirely with this broader institutional reading of events and maintain firmly instead that Harry's underlying safety concerns have been genuine, consistent, and sincerely held throughout this entire multi-year saga, entirely regardless of how the government or the palace has ultimately chosen to respond to those concerns at any given point along the way. Whatever specific position you personally land on across everything we have just walked through, one thing seems genuinely and unavoidably certain. This particular story is far from finished, and I do not think it resolves cleanly anytime soon. There are still a genuine number of real, unresolved questions circulating around all of this. Questions about the reported request connected specifically to Diana's grave and what that visit might ultimately involve or produce. Questions about what Netflix may expect commercially from any future Sussex-related projects going forward given everything currently unfolding. And larger questions about what happens to this entire dynamic if the distance between Harry and the rest of the royal family continues to widen over the coming years rather than beginning to close. What do you think? Does that specific gap between the privately commissioned 40-page report and the government's ultimate liaison officer response genuinely tell you something real about how seriously the underlying threat was actually assessed by the people with access to independent intelligence? Or is there a more sympathetic and equally plausible explanation for that gap that fits the available facts just as well without requiring bad faith on anyone's part? Drop your take in the comments, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one.